Well, after having provided the definitive ranking of the incredible first season of Columbo, I have decided to wade back into the fray and break down the second act of the world's foremost ambassador for the functionality of trench coats, Lieutenant Columbo. The rules remain unchanged for this go-round. I will again be looking at these 5 key elements. If anyone has in fact watched my ranking of Season 1, you may have noticed that one person always seemed to get a perfect score, that being the legend that is Peter Falk. Will that remain the same this time? We'll see. During that section of the discussion, I'll also work in any other assorted thoughts I had about the episode while continuing to extol the brilliance of Peter Falk. For time's sake, I won't be explaining the rationale or details of the other 4 categories I'll be scoring. Please revisit the beginning of the Season 1 video if you need it. The final score will be out of 25 once again. Now let's go! The season opener was Etude in Black, directed by Nicholas Colasanto. John Cassavetes stars as a renowned conductor who murders his mistress to avoid having his affair revealed to his wife, which would result in his wealthy mother-in-law closing the money valve that has afforded him the lifestyle that he enjoys. I thought John Cassavetes was very good. He's playing a very cold, temperamental character with quite a large reputation and ego that he exercises and revels in. In contrast to many of the killers in the first season, his character of Alex Benedict is a lot less obvious about his guilt, which is nice. Quite often in Season 1, the murderers come off as very guilty. We, the audience, already know this, and Columbo always suspects it almost instantly, but it's still nice when the killer tries a little harder to act surprised or like a grieving friend or spouse. The episode is longer than the usual episodes last season, and that extended runtime gives plenty of opportunities for Columbo and Alex Benedict to interact and build tension between the two of them. Both men do extremely well in their scenes. John Cassavetes gets 4 out of 5. For the guest cast, right off the bat I have to mention Myrna Loy as John Cassavetes' mother-in-law. I love Myrna Loy. Most people probably think of her as Nora Charles from the Thin Man series, but to me she will always be most closely associated with her roles in Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House and The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer, both opposite the inimitable Cary Grant. She's used very well playing the wealthy woman that is holding the purse strings. Blythe Danner is good too as the wife of Alex Benedict. She's a very fragile woman and Blythe Danner plays her very well. And Mr. Miyagi himself, Pat Morita, shows up as the Benedict family butler. A good little ensemble and one that gets 3 out of 5. The murder scene is great, and following in the tradition of suitable for framing, the victim gets bumped off while playing the piano. But prior to this, there is plenty of setup, picking up the car, going back and forth, the staging of the scene in the kitchen and at the victim's house. All of it is laid out so brilliantly and also, like suitable for framing, without dialogue. Only the visuals guide us through it. The murder itself, as we watch Alex putting on his gloves, wrapping the murder weapon in a handkerchief, and then brutally striking her from behind, it's chilling and reminded me of Gene Barry in Prescription Murder. I also thought it was clever, but also somewhat haunting, that the woman dies silently, but then her pet bird keeps screaming as Alex drags her body through the house. I'll go 5 out of 5. The finale is wonderful, and is one of the few times where you can see it coming almost from the beginning, which is perfect. I've said before that the biggest issue I often have with this show is the endings, which sometimes come out of nowhere, and I go, that's what caught them? But not so here. It is set up so perfectly long in advance. The moment when Alex realizes during the concert that his flower is missing is excellent, as is that zoom in on the dropped flower superimposed over the lenses of his sunglasses. And from that moment on, it's pretty much a waiting game to see how Columbo is going to use that flower to expose Alex's guilt. When he finally does, showing the concert footage side by side with the interview footage, is so satisfying. You can feel this sense of dread settle over Alex as he's watching this play out, and he knows his world is coming to an end. It is very satisfying, but also heartbreaking as you watch his wife have to face his guilt as well. I loved how downbeat it is, and Alex just calmly asks to go now after confirming that Columbo knew all along. 5 out of 5. Peter Falk is excellent as usual. Columbo's love of classical music that we heard about in Blueprint for Murder rears its head again, and he admits to even being a fan of Alex Benedict's. We meet his dog for the first time as well, all very good stuff. For some other various notes, I love both the locations and the score this time around. There is extensive location shooting at the Hollywood Bowl, the the site of the concert that was supposed to be Alex's alibi, and I loved seeing it in the early 70s. And the score, using classical music playing over the police finding the body, is somewhat eerie, as well as those forlorn piano tunes that play during the episode. 5 out of 5 all around. The Greenhouse Jungle was the second episode, directed by Boris Sagal. Ray Milland returns to Columbo, but gone are the days of his playing a grieving widower in Death Lends a Hand, doubting the wily lieutenant and completely owning his baldness. No, what we have here is an altogether different sort of man. Here he plays Jarvis Goodland, the orchid-loving man with a suspiciously full head of hair that helps his nephew with a fake kidnapping scheme and then kills his nephew and makes off with the ransom. I think Ray Milland is great, but this character is not. The writing for him is not very good at all. That's the first thing. The performance is something else, to be sure, but the script forces Ray Milland to narrate every action he takes early on. I mentioned in the last episode how nice it is to watch an elaborate plot play out without dialogue, trusting the audience to follow along. But not here. Good old Uncle Jarvis spells out every single thing he and his dear nephew Tony are doing in laborious detail, constantly explaining and clarifying the plan. It's almost shocking to go from Etude in Black to this. I'm quite torn on what to give Ray Milland as a score this time. It's objectively not a good performance, but I still kind of liked it. He's overacting like crazy, but he does pretty well opposite Peter Falk, playing the usual irritated rich man being annoyed by Columbo. I did enjoy how much of the dirty work he has to do himself, shoving a car off a cliff, sneaking around the house to switch guns, and all that. Let's go 3 out of 5. I'd feel bad giving Ray Milland anything less. The guest stars are overall a little meh. Bradford Dillman as the nephew is just not very memorable, and that's probably the biggest problem for me. It's been a little while since I watched this one, and if I can't even remember what he looked like, let alone what he did, that's an issue. Sandra Smith as the nephew's wife is also so-so, and William Smith shows up as her muscle-bound boyfriend she has on the side. I like William Smith. I grew up watching a lot of Laredo, and while I don't like that he would often get typecast as these meathead characters, he does pretty well. It's a small role, but he makes the most of it. And finally, there is Bob Dishy as Sergeant Wilson, a young detective who is very eager to help the already famous Lieutenant Columbo. He and Peter Falk have good chemistry in their scenes, and his presence bumps this up to 3 out of 5. The murder is underwhelming. The fake kidnapping brings to mind Lee Grant's devious plan from Ransom for a Dead Man, with the key difference that this ransom is for a live man, temporarily, until Ray Milland blows Tony away after they've collected said ransom. There's not much more to it than that, so I'll have to go 2 out of 5. The finale is middle of the road for me, in that it's a good ending from a police work standpoint, but the execution is just alright. I really like the bullet being found in the soil, proving the gun in the wife's closet was the one that Jarvis fired at a burglar all those months ago. Although, he can't be that avid of a gardener if he never turned the dirt and uncovered the slugs ages ago. Maybe they were buried really deep. What do I know about these ballistic issues? 3 out of 5 for this one. Peter Falk is great once again. The inevitable 5 out of 5 I'm going to give him could probably be bumped up to a 6 out of 5 just for the incredible stunt he pulls off early in the episode. Columbo, who we already know is no fan of heights, goes careening down a cliffside to make it to the car that Ray Milland and company pushed over. It's an excellent shot, and his panic running is maybe the biggest laugh I've had while watching this show so far. And besides that, there's the little subplot of bringing a sickly-looking plant to Ray Milland's greenhouse to get some tender, loving care. It looks decidedly out of place next to the horticultural fortune that is Uncle Jarvis's orchid collection, and I loved watching Columbo collect it on his way home, after sending Jarvis to the slammer. Like I said, 5 out of 5, bordering on more, but I don't want to set that precedent. The Most Crucial Game is up next, directed by Jeremy Kagan. Yet another alumni of Death Lends a Hand returns, although Robert Culp does not get to switch sides from killer to innocent bystander like Ray Milland did, vice versa. No, Robert Culp is most definitely the murderer, once again, and like last season, I think he's excellent. He looks a bit different, having gone full 70s hair since his last episode, and sporting a mustache. He's playing the general manager of a football team who decides to end the life of the irresponsible punk who currently owns the team. He's again your sort of quintessential Columbo villain, very impatient, with a bad temper. It's a very solid performance, and one that gets 4 out of 5. The victim this time is Dean Stockwell, that irresponsible punk that I was just mentioning. He's the epitome of a spoiled man-child, sleeping in till the middle of the day, in black sheets no less, and whiling away his time around his luxurious poolside mansion. He's not exactly a sympathetic victim, but his murder still must be solved. Dean Jagger shows up as the family lawyer. Like Don Amici last season, this is another case of a former bigger-name actor showing up in a very brief role and doing a wonderful job. I like the character's suspicious nature, doing things that upset the family he's working for because he believes he has their best interests at heart. James Gregory appears as the coach of the football team. He's basically playing the same guy from Short Fuse, but this one wears a red jacket. He's loud and brash and acts exactly like you'd hope James Gregory would in such a role. Val Avery plays an oily private investigator who gets roped into the case, and I thought he was very well cast. In contrast to the charming PIs that headline such shows as The Rockford Files, a show I absolutely love, this gumshoe is a slippery character who seems possibly disreputable and felt very real. And finally, Rhoda, aka Valerie Harper, has a brief role as what we in Columbo believe to be an assistant to the aforementioned PI. And then we all slowly catch on that she's a lady of the evening. It's quite the scene, with Peter Falk becoming very uncomfortable and managing to scare off a potential client. This cast gets 4 out of 5. The murder is very good, and is another lengthy, nearly dialogue-free sequence. Watching Robert Culp nervously make his costume change and leave the stadium as an ice cream man is quite tense. I also liked his phone call alibi quite a bit, with the use of the portable radio and the use of a block of ice as a blunt instrument. It's excellent. And then he tosses it into the pool to melt. Showing not telling is great and represents another well-plotted, suspenseful crime in the Columbo oeuvre. 4 out of 5. I'm sorry to say that I found the finale a little lacking. After all the extensive plotting of the murder and the ensuing investigation, the big gotcha is that you can't hear the clock from Robert Culp's box during his phone call with Dean Stockwell. And that opens up a couple questions for me. What if the clock wasn't wound during that particular phone call? What if Culp carried the phone and his portable radio into the bathroom? What if he moved the clock away from him, claiming to be annoyed by the ticking while he's trying to focus on the game? Methinks his lawyer would raise those same questions at his upcoming trial, and General Manager Paul Hanlon would be off scot-free. I'm going 1 out of 5 due to my disappointment during the wrap-up. Peter Falk is quite good, what a surprise, but for the first time, I have a beef with Columbo's behavior this time around. Once Dean Stockwell's body is discovered, there are police everywhere. The coroner is waiting around to report his findings, and Columbo is sitting in his car, listening to the football game on the radio, showing no respect for the time of his fellow officers. And once they finally drag him over to the scene of the crime, he gets sidetracked listening to the game once again, ignoring the coroner who's been waiting to speak to him. I'm all for Columbo needling, irritating, and berating the suspects in these cases, but don't make life rough for your colleagues, especially for something like a football game. What score am I going to give him? Five out of 5. The excess goodwill he earned with that impressive downward run in the previous episode clears him of any wrongdoing, in my opinion. Also, I love the clue he picks up on almost instantly when discovering the water that has been splashed around does not contain chlorine, thus exposing that someone sprayed down the scene with a garden hose. I enjoyed his antagonism towards Robert Culp while confronting him, and the way he makes that private detective sweat about whether he'll get his license back. And the locations. There are huge, impressive locations this time, from the airport, the bank of phone booths, which is quite an unusual sight in a world that has now largely given up on phone booths, and the football stadium itself, where much of the action takes place. And lastly, I loved this shot of Columbo walking away. It brought to mind the opening of another show I've talked about on this channel, Agatha Christie's Poirot. The 4th episode of Season 2 was... Dagger of the Mind, directed by Richard Quine. Notably, this was the first episode not set in California, instead being filmed and set in London. Also for the first time, we have 2 killers, played by Richard Basehart and Honor Blackman, of Goldfinger fame. I realized Suitable for Framing had an accomplice to the killing, but Ross Martin was really the only one focused on in that episode. But back to Basehart and Blackman. They play a married couple who also happen to be renowned Shakespearean actors that wind up killing their producer. They're both quite good as these vain actors, but there are a few moments where the writing allows them to play up the scenes a little too much. I'm thinking especially of the one in which they're sitting up in bed, reading reviews to the opening of their new production of Macbeth. They're gleefully reading the good ones and trying to ignore the bad ones. The performances almost dip into parody, which, if that's what they were going for, that's fine, but I felt it was all a little broad and on the nose. We'll get to the ending yet, but I'll go 3 out of 5 for this dynamic duo. John Williams has an unfortunately brief role in the episode. Brief because he's the victim, and unfortunate because I really like John Williams. His presence made me wish it had been Ray Milland in the Richard Basehart role, partly because I think that would have been a fun role for Milland to take on, and also for the opportunity to see the foes from Dial M for Murder face off once more. Wilfred Hyde White is wonderful as Tanner, the butler to John Williams' character. At first, he's the ultimate English butler, all yes sirs and no sirs, and then he gets wise to the guilt of these two thespians and proceeds to blackmail them. The scene in which he basically declares himself to be their new butler, since he's now without an employer, was excellent. He's so genial about it and happily wanders around their apartment, telling them he's going to serve breakfast while implying they will be paying him for a good long time. His smiling facade is so deceptive as to his intentions, and I loved it. I also really enjoyed Bernard Fox as a Scotland Yard detective who accidentally winds up involving Columbo in the murder case. He's good, but does next to no police work, so he's like a less useful Chief Inspector Japp, again from Poirot. It's a fun little group of British acting talent, and one that gets 4 out of 5. The killing this time is interesting in that it's accidental, but that's the most interesting part about it. The motive is set up very briefly, and the fight that ensues ends abruptly, so there's not a lot to go on here. It's another one where the covering up of the crime is the main point of the drama, and even this is somewhat skipped over. We spend more time watching Richard Basehart set a book on the side table than we do showing them dragging his body to the staircase, so it felt a little lazy. I did enjoy the visual of this massive trunk strapped to the back of their little British roadster, so I'll go 2 out of 5. Oh, and by the way, there's a second murder, that of the butler, which is uncovered in a shocking pan over to his feet dangling from where he's been strung up. The ending this time was great. First of all, it's set in a wax museum. I enjoy going to wax museums, and I enjoy scenes set in them, so that's immediately a boost. But the best part is that Columbo draws a confession out of them. When he started explaining that there should be a pearl trapped in the folds of John Williams' umbrella, I got a little nervous, afraid we were headed for another contact lens style scene from Death Lens a Hand, but thankfully we weren't. If it had gone that way, it still would have been better, since it was set up more naturally, with Columbo discovering a piece of the necklace from their fight long in advance. So then you know it's always in the back of Honor Blackman's mind that Columbo has suspicions about the necklace. They unfurl the umbrella, and wouldn't you know it, a pearl rolls out. Now, if it had gotten there naturally, I'd have my doubts. It's been packed up, hauled across London, unpacked, set up to adorn this wax figure. I'm thinking this pearl would have gone missing at some point. But then Columbo reveals that he planted it there while everyone was watching. There's no ambiguity about how it got there, it's just a prime example of Columbo's cunning that leads to them confessing. The confessing, though. Richard Basehart begins laughing maniacally. If you watched my Season 1 video, specifically the portion on short fuse, you'll know I'm no fan of maniacal laughing, especially when it's performed by a certain actor who won't be named. I don't love it here either, but I think Richard Basehart does pull it off to a certain degree, and you wonder if he's actually suffering a breakdown. Honor Blackman is largely just hysterical and was very good. This ending gets 4 out of 5. The best part of this whole episode, though, is seeing Columbo on vacation. The opening at the airport was a little obnoxious, but when Columbo jumps from the car to run over and begin snapping pictures of the changing of the guard, I was loving it. I don't know for sure, but it seems as though they just released Peter Falk into a crowd of people and filmed whatever happened. If this was all completely set up, that's almost more impressive because it looks so natural. He's darting in between people, walking into the street, and he's got this awestruck, wondrous look in his eyes. It's a great scene. And it's not just there. There are scenes with him running across Tower Bridge, taking a tour of the Thames with Bernard Fox, including him taking photos of Fox. And the ending shows Columbo walking up the steps of Royal Albert Hall. The location photography is wonderful, and the handheld nature gives it such immediacy. It's the foggy, overcast London that you picture when you think of that city, and I loved it. The episode as a whole is too long, bumped up to 1 hour and 37 minutes, and I'm thinking that happened since it was a special episode filmed overseas. The pacing's slower, but if it's between having a shorter episode and missing those Columbo abroad sequences, or making it longer and including them, I'll take the latter. 5 out of 5. please, please. It's not necessary. Well, you could have gone a little longer, but that's fine. Episode 5 brings us to Requiem for a Falling Star, directed once again by Richard Quine. Anne Baxter is our murderess this time, as she plays a fading, or shall we say falling, movie star who kills her long-suffering assistant. Her performance is almost equal parts great and so-so. The times where she gets to play a seasoned celebrity, graciously greeting Columbo and patiently wading through his declarations of being a huge fan or smoothly avoiding the photographers and crowds of fans waiting for her, in all of that she's very good. She has a practiced smile and air about her that is very convincing, and as Anne Baxter was a movie star whose peak days of fame were behind her, it's not a stretch to believe she could do this in real life. But at other times, she seemed somewhat overwrought or overly dramatic, particularly in the delivery of some of her dialogue. Her grief about the death of her assistant seems phony, which it is, but one would think an actress of her experience could do a better job of faking it. And her performance in the final scene was strange. That shaky turn when Columbo surprises her and that weird, slinky walk across the room, it's not terrible, but it seems overly theatrical, which you could say makes sense for the character, but I didn't love it. Overall, 3 out of 5. Mel Ferrer is her main foe in the episode, playing a former gossip columnist, now an author specializing in filling books with the dirty secrets of the Hollywood elite. I thought he was very good and is able to pull off a smooth, slippery character like this with ease. Pippa Scott plays the assistant who gets killed, seemingly on accident, which is exactly what Anne Baxter wanted you to think. She's good, but is on screen so briefly to not make a huge impact. Kevin McCarthy felt a little stiff and affects an odd voice as a major studio head that is willing to go to bat for Anne Baxter. William Bryant pops up as a cop in a couple of scenes. I always like him in westerns that he would appear in during the late 60s or early 70s, so it was fun seeing him here. Sidney Miller plays the director of the TV show that Anne Baxter is filming in the episode. He was fun casting, as he was both a character actor like this and a real-life TV director throughout the 60s and beyond. And finally, the legendary costume designer Edith Head makes an appearance as herself. Anne Baxter mentions Edith Head a couple of times, and I thought it was just an easy, familiar reference that audiences would recognize. But then she shows up in person, alongside her desk that is covered in Oscars, even supplying Columbo with a new tie, which I would say is not an improvement over his usual choice. The rest of the cast is fun, but just that cameo alone bumps the ensemble to 4 out of 5. The murder is maybe the most offhanded and least orchestrated such sequence I've seen so far. Anne Baxter splashes a couple of gas cans around, then strikes a match as the car carrying her assistant pulls onto the driveway. I get that not every one of these murders needs to be an intricately plotted and executed nail-biter, but this one felt, dare I say, not that interesting. The flames leaping up around Anne Baxter were shockingly close to her, and the explosion was fun in these days before CGI flames began cluttering up our screens, so I'll go 2 out of 5. The finale is quite good though. Anne Baxter's performance during it I've already mentioned, but I have to admit I did not see the twist coming that her husband was buried under the water fountain that adorns her garden. It's a surprisingly grim reveal and really surprised me. The road to that scene is a little clumsy though, and for that I'll blame the writing. There are several clues that were set up so obviously, like Columbo just happening to catch a clip of Anne Baxter's old movie on TV that establishes her dressing like a man to impersonate her husband. I wonder if that will become relevant. Or Columbo noticing the large Shriner ring on the photo of her husband, a photo that just so happens to have been taken the day before his death. So he was definitely wearing it when he disappeared and or was killed. There are a couple others as well that all seem to have a blinking sign hanging over them that says, "Look, I'm a clue!" Not to be too hard on all this, because I did like the resolution as a whole, so much so that it gets 3 out of 5. And Peter Falk. His getting to play up being a starstruck fan is wonderful, including trying to call his wife to get Anne Baxter to say hello to her, and instead getting his brother-in-law, George, who seems to hang out at Columbo's house a lot. He tries to call again later in the episode, and only gets George once more. When it happened again, I thought it was definitely setting up one last time, perhaps during the finale while Anne Baxter is being arrested, the comedy rule of threes and all that, but unfortunately it wasn't to be. I really like the movie studio setting. The behind-the-scenes look at Hollywood and sound stages is always enjoyable to me, but that brings me to a strange thing that Columbo says. At one point, he tells Anne Baxter that in all his years of living in LA, he's never been to a movie studio. I'm going to chalk this up to his trying to come off as an ordinary guy in awe of all the movie magic around him, because otherwise, Columbo appears to have a very poor memory. If you'll remember, His extremely aggressive interrogation of the girlfriend in Prescription Murder happens at a movie studio on a movie set, no less. Or was that less rumpled, clean-cut Columbo that solved the perfect murder committed by Gene Barry a different Columbo? I don't want to even get into all that, so I'll say he was trying to be a common man to drop Ann Baxter's guard, or was he? I also really like the scene showing how they pull off process filming, with the rear projection screen and the cutaway car on a rig being moved and turned as needed. I loved all that. 5 out of 5. A Stitch in Crime was the 6th episode of Season 2, love that title by the way, and was directed by Hy Averback. The murderer this time is played by none other than Leonard Nimoy, and his years as a Vulcan seem to have rubbed off on him, because he displays an extreme coldness and lack of emotion when pulling off multiple murders. But I thought he was fantastic, playing a surgeon who murders a nurse who suspects him of making an intentional fatal error during his last surgery. What was so brilliant about his portrayal was the evolution of his demeanor and his attitude toward Columbo and the ever-tightening noose that Columbo was holding. In contrast to so many other killers on this show, he is able to maintain his composure for a very long time. He knows the right things to say, the right questions to ask that seem as though he's a somewhat helpful, mildly unaffected co-worker of the murdered woman. As the case goes on and Columbo's persistence wears him down, he does start to get a little testier, but it makes sense. A lot of the murderers in previous episodes seem to give the game away too soon. Their guilt is overly obvious, and it's just a matter of Columbo finding some shred of evidence to arrest them. But this fact plays into the character himself, which Columbo even addresses early on. He is calm and controlled with incredible focus. He spars with Columbo very well, especially in the scene where he begins laughing uncontrollably at Columbo's suggestions about him, and that scene gets really good. I'll talk about that at the end, but in the meantime, Leonard Nimoy gets 5 out of 5. The supporting cast is great as well. Will Geer plays the older colleague of Leonard Nimoy, and he's always a welcome presence. He spends much of his time in a hospital bed and is quite endearing in his limited screen time. You find yourself expecting him to drop dead at any moment, courtesy of the dissolving suture, or Stitch in Crime if you prefer, that his dear friend tied off his heart valve with. But at the beginning, seeing him in a lab coat did remind me of his role as the doctor/maniacal leader of The Town, a wonderful episode of Mission Impossible. Anne Francis plays the nurse who is bumped off with a tire iron, and I thought the role was so much better than what she was saddled with back in Short Fuse. And she plays it beautifully. She's tense and suspicious and obviously cares a great deal for Will Geer's character, so much so that it gets her killed. And finally, Nita Talbot plays the friend of Anne Francis that gets involved in the case and was very good as well. She plays a very funny scene where she teaches Columbo a cure for sneezing, and that was a fun little moment worked in. I had a great time with all of them. 5 out of 5. The killings, plural, are quite well done. The initial murder of Anne Francis is quick and brutal in a parking garage, followed by Nimoy staging a mugging. He then goes to her house and sets up the drug pilfering angle to her character that doesn't exist. All of that was quite good, again, showing not telling is perfect. All of the steps he takes are in keeping with his methodical character. The attempted murder of Will Geer, taking place during a surgery, is also a very interesting idea, and the murder of a former military friend of Anne Francis is well staged as well. This one is made to look like a drug overdose and involves some interesting imagery with swirling, multicolored shapes appearing and disappearing as the man is losing consciousness. All of these are made to look like accidents, or to disguise motives, and it's quite the balancing act of narratives that the good doctor has constructed. I'll say 4 out of 5, only deducting a point because other than the surgery, the others don't feel that memorable. The lead up to the finale is very well handled, and the final scene is quite good, just a little abbreviated for my taste. But in that lead up, Columbo has uncovered the suture as being the reason for Anne Francis' suspicions, and has gotten Leonard Nimoy worried enough to induce an emergency that calls for a second surgery on Will Geer. That whole idea felt to me like the jackhammering of the building that I love so much in Blueprint for Murder, and again, leads to an apparent dead end for the investigation, when no dissolving suture is discovered. Columbo admits his defeat, strips off the scrubs he was wearing, and leaves the room, and for a brief moment, we, and Leonard Nimoy, think he's gotten away with it. And then Columbo bursts back in and reveals the incriminating suture to be in the scrubs he himself was wearing, and we cut to credits. It's a fun, last-minute reveal along the lines of suitable for framing, but it's far too quick. I would have liked at least one more shot of the defeated look settling over Leonard Nimoy's face. But that's not what happened, so this finale gets another 4 out of 5. And Peter Falk himself, He's very good, what else is new, and gets to play a more irritable Columbo early on, talking of hardly getting any sleep and caring for his sick wife. He does muck up a crime scene with hard-boiled eggshells, which is bringing him back to the most crucial game territory, but I'll allow it. The man was obviously very tired. He also seems to be dealing with his own cold or some ailment, but Nita Talbot's handy cure fixes that up. We uncover another fear that our intrepid lieutenant has, this being an aversion to hospitals in general and operating rooms in particular. He barely makes it through watching an operation and makes his escape after a crash course on suture varieties, but he seems to be all cured by the ending, watching Leonard Nimoy open up Will Geer for the second time with an eagle eye on the proceedings. The best moment of the episode, though, is during the scene where Leonard Nimoy begins laughing at Columbo. The strain of the last few days and the possibly imminent death of Will Geer all boil over in that moment, and Columbo slams the desk and tells him of his suspicions. It's an excellent scene and recalls Columbo's merciless interrogation back in Prescription Murder. This is also a rare occasion where Columbo tells the killer of his suspicions prior to pulling the rug out from under him, which is required to set in motion the operation that unearths the evidence he desperately needs, saving Will Geer in the process. It's no surprise that he easily walks away with a 5 out of 5 once again. The most crucial game, the most dangerous match, was the next move played this season, and was directed by Edward M. Abrams. Laurence Harvey is the first character we meet, who just so happens to eventually become a killer. Surprise, surprise. He is playing chess champion Emmett Clayton, who is having to defend his title against a previously retired Russian chess master, and decides to off the poor man rather than risk losing to him. His performance is almost frustratingly consistent, which may sound like an odd complaint, but what I mean is that he does a lot of grimacing and squinting and generally just being in ill humor. So his character doesn't present a lot of opportunities for fun interactions between himself and Columbo, or anyone, really. He does get a chance to be shaken from his dour demeanor by the nightmares and premonitions of losing the upcoming match, and Laurence Harvey does do a great job in those scenes. And I love the moment when he calls out Columbo for bringing him back to the French restaurant while speaking to the waiter. It came out of nowhere and demonstrates that this man is as smart as we've been led to believe. I found myself somewhat confused as to his hearing abilities, though, which is a problem considering the episode's finale depends on that. I know he wears a hearing aid, but I didn't realize that's what it was early on. There's a line during the chess game in his hotel room about his listening to music for concentration, so then I thought his earpiece was for that. But shortly after, it's called a hearing aid again. So I don't know, it wasn't all that clear to me, and I'll talk more about that later. But let's get to the most disturbing part about this character. His sideburns. What is going on with them? In the scenes where he's fending off a gaggle of reporters, they're so long and greasy and wispy. Thankfully, later, the hair and makeup team stepped in and kept them a little more contained, but that was a close one. This performance and character is a very low-key, middle-of-the-road one, and because of that, earns my very first 2.5 out of 5. Jack Kruschen, on the other hand, is wonderful as the Russian chess master Tomlin Dudek. He's this very likable teddy bear of a man, but is obviously brilliant. His gregarious nature always left me uncertain if he really was manipulating Laurence Harvey's character or not. If some of his little comments were in fact mind games, he hides it very well. The rest of the cast was pretty forgettable, with Heidi Brühl as Dudek's assistant, some of the Russian team that has accompanied Dudek making hardly an impression, but I'll go 3 out of 5 for Jack Kruschen alone. The crime itself was quite good, but also fairly standard stuff for Columbo. The tape over lock to gain entrance is a fun, low-tech ploy, and I liked his convincing Dudek to write the note for him. I'm not sure why it was so important that Dudek write the note in his native tongue, though. The fact that Clayton requests he write it in Russian implies that Dudek is capable of writing in English. So why, if the police are to believe the note was intended for Clayton, would he write it in a language the receiver can't speak? Regardless, the use of an industrial trash disposal unit as a murder weapon is grisly but unique, even if the shove through the doors wouldn't quite have been sufficient to carry him all the way to the chute. Clayton and Dudek would have had a bit of a fight on the way there, but we're left to just imagine that. Something else that is reused is the device of having the victim survive the initial attack, and then the killer either having to hope that his survival is short-lived or taking steps to attempt a murder again. We saw this the first time, again, back in Prescription Murder. In this one, though, Clayton does end up switching the medication that Dudek requires, in effect having a doctor kill Dudek on his behalf, on accident. I very much enjoyed that as well, so I'll go 3 out of 5. The finale seems like a good idea, but the inconsistent, at least to me, hearing aid element of the plot is what makes it falter. The The lead up to it was fun, with Columbo interrogating Clayton, while Clayton is taking on multiple chess opponents and carrying on the games while still becoming increasingly rattled. But then, Columbo taking him down to the trash disposal room, that's where things didn't work for me. Because the reveal is that the machine was shut down in the middle of their conversation, and Clayton didn't notice, just like the killer did. This taking into account that the killer would have known how to start it up again while in the midst of committing the crime and hoping no hotel employees were about to walk in. And I don't buy it. Clayton uses a hearing aid, so he obviously has some hearing left. How could he have not noticed that this gigantic contraption has powered down? And even if he was 100% deaf, wouldn't the whole room and floor be vibrating while the machine is running, and then suddenly it's not vibrating anymore? Setting aside that, I don't buy Columbo's premise. I would think it's just as likely that someone not aware of the safety mechanism that shuts down the machine would have shoved someone down the chute and then fled the scene before things got messy. I don't know how to feel about this finale. I like the idea, in theory, but it felt anticlimactic and another one of those, that's how we caught him? 2 out of 5. And Peter Falk himself, he's dependably great. We get a reappearance of his dog, and with him we see the doctor, played by Michael Fox, that Columbo first went to back in Etude in Black. And the dog actually has a couple of functions. He's not just a subplot. It's through his actions that we learn about the safety mechanism at the hotel, and the phone call from the doctor at the restaurant gives an excellent opportunity to watch Clayton really start to sweat. He survived? He's awake? He's going to be all right? Oh, he's talking about a dog. And let me just mention the opening scene, which is probably the best part of the episode. It's this wild, psychedelic dream sequence as Clayton is standing in the middle of a giant chessboard. The image of the chess pieces sliding toward him is kind of unsettling, and seeing Dudek's face appear while this fog is hanging over everything and the lights are flashing, it's a creepy sequence, and I thought it was a great opening. 5 out of 5. We have now reached the season finale, Double Shock, directed by Robert Butler. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself with this review, but I loved Double Shock. And the first reason why is Martin Landau. I'm a huge Martin Landau fan to begin with. I actually had the great honor of meeting him back in 2015, and he was so friendly and gracious as I gushed to him about how much I love him in Mission Impossible, but it goes beyond that. He was great well into his later years too, like in Remember, where he starred with Christopher Plummer, and he told me about just having finished filming his scenes for that movie when I met him. Or in Lovely Still, a truly heartbreaking Christmas film that I think contains an incredible performance from Mr. Landau. But back to Double Shock. He is fantastic in the dual role of Dexter and Norman Paris, twin brothers who hate one another, but set aside their differences long enough to murder their wealthy uncle. Just a note on their last name of Paris. Leonard Nimoy's character in Mission Impossible, meant to replace Martin Landau after he left, was called the Great Paris. Between Landau, Nimoy, and Ross Martin, Columbo already has guest starred some of the greatest disguise experts in spy television history. I'll try to stop getting sidetracked. Martin Landau plays the brothers so well, and I think made an excellent choice by keeping the differences between the two as fairly subtle. Norman is the more controlled, businesslike, and pompous brother, where Dexter is more outgoing, a flashy TV star. In Mission Impossible, Martin Landau played such a variety of characters, and he could sometimes go more broad with his performances. And keeping the two brothers more low-key, especially in terms of their voices, was excellent. And what I loved about this episode is that it's the first true whodunit episode of Columbo. The twin aspect of the plot is as much for the audience as it is Columbo, because we see one version of Martin Landau commit the murder, but which one actually did it? And with the two brothers constantly accusing one another and coming up with plausible motives and reasons why the other one could be guilty, it really keeps us guessing. After a while, I did begin to suspect that both were involved, but it still works so well. 5 out of 5 for the legend that is Martin Landau. The ensemble that makes up the rest of the guest cast might be my favorite one so far. Each character is so well defined and given plenty of opportunities for interesting and fun exchanges with Columbo. You've got Paul Stewart as the murdered uncle. He's a character actor I always enjoy seeing and is good in his few scenes. There's Catwoman Julie Newmar playing the young fiancée of Uncle Clifford. She does a great job as well as this sort of airheaded fitness fanatic. Speaking of which, the scene where Columbo visits her apartment and she's doing aerobics, perhaps? Maybe I'm not well versed enough in stretching and all that, but my goodness, that is an odd position to put your neck and arms in. But the scene following that, which gets quite intense, is one of two where Columbo has to talk his way out of a situation. The dialogue, this being another Stephen Bochco script, is wonderful. Tim O'Connor plays the slimy lawyer, Hathaway. At first he just seems like a pleasant friend of the uncle, and the scene where he's wanting to make sure he's considered as a suspect until he finds out he is one is fun, but when he makes the switch to full-on money-hungry lawyer, it's great. He does it all so nonchalantly and just oozes corruption. And the scene where he discovers Julie Newmar's been murdered, he's great. And Jeanette Nolan as the extremely loyal Mrs. Peck, the housekeeper for Uncle Clifford, her performance is so great. The scenes between her and Columbo are some of the best parts of this episode, as our favorite lieutenant slowly, and quite accidentally, begins driving her insane with his untidy tendencies. Each interaction spirals out of control into her screaming for him to get away from her and out of the house, until he makes a really vulnerable, heartfelt appeal for her to give him a chance, and it seems like they patch things over, and then he pulls the knob off of her TV and she loses it once again. And finally, last but not least, is a young Dabney Coleman as the gum-chewing Sergeant Murray. I did not recognize him at first since he had a shockingly full head of hair, but right from he and Columbo's first moments together, I loved the pairing. So often, Columbo ends up getting briefed by a uniformed cop or a fairly anonymous detective that leaves the scene quickly, but Dabney Coleman and Peter Falk have such great chemistry and deliver all of their dialogue in these tired, under-their-breath voices like two pros talking shop. And then he keeps popping up throughout the case, right through to the final scene. Amazing cast and compelling characters, 5 out of 5. The crime itself is a fairly brief sequence, with seemingly one of the brothers sneaking into the house and then just walking straight into the bathroom while the uncle is in the tub. The fact that the killer just walks in and keeps talking to his uncle while he plugs in an electric mixer and drops it into the tub, electrocuting him, is so bold, first of all, and chilling. And Martin Landau delivers the dialogue with a somewhat shaky, unhinged voice. And then, the discovery of the body. Seeing this electric bike still running while Paul Stewart is draped over it, swaying with the motion, it's one of the most disturbing images in the series thus far. 5 out of 5. The final scene is brilliant in how straightforward it is. There's no tricks, no leap in logic. The finale depends on strictly common sense. One of the Paris brothers could not lift a dead body out of the bathtub alone. It's that simple. And the housekeeper knows for a fact that her TV was out for 15 seconds. There's no possible way that someone could make it from the second floor to the basement to get the power back on in less than a minute. It's not flashy, it's maybe not the most memorable finale, but it's satisfying. And the ever-logical Norman admits everything because he knows they've been caught. This is one of the few endings that I walked away from completely happy with how the episode closed out. Suitable for framing is, and always will be I suspect, the gold standard, but this still gets 5 out of 5. Peter Falk, as I've already mentioned, is excellent in the scenes where he tries to calm down either Mrs. Peck or Julie Newmar's character. But the greatest moment he has is during the cooking segment, where Columbo is suddenly called on stage during Dexter Paris's TV show, The Pleasures of Paris. Oh boy. What follows is one of the most enjoyable scenes I've seen so far in Columbo, where Dexter gets the detectives to assist him in preparing hollandaise sauce. It feels like the whole sequence was done in one take, and probably ad-libbed, with maybe a loose outline to follow. Peter Falk and Martin Landau play off one another incredibly, and you see Columbo as shy and lovable, and Martin Landau gets to display the charm he had so much of. It almost didn't feel like the Dexter we've seen so far, but you could chalk that up to this being his TV persona. Either way, the scene is hilarious, in particular Columbo's repeated, when asked questions. In a way, it reminded me of this old Johnny Carson segment where Vincent Price teaches him how to cook fish in a dishwasher. I love this scene. On another note, the TV shows within the show that Mrs. Peck is so drawn to watching. They're so cheap, with two actors filmed in tight close-up, shot, reverse shot, from unflattering low angles. Why NBC couldn't just put in some clips from an actual show on their own network, I'm not sure, but it was just funny how Mrs. Peck was so engrossed in these shows that are clearly uninteresting. And finally, I thought the way in which the twins were filmed worked very well. For most of the episode, they're kept separate, and if they share a scene, they're also filmed separately. We get one split-screen shot, Parent Trap style, and then Columbo leads them and Dabney Coleman through the house. The way these shots are filmed and edited works really well, and they were careful to cut just before the second Martin Landau is about to come into frame or keep his head just out of shot. It was clever and likely more practical from a technical and budgetary standpoint than repeated split-screen sequences would have been. All in all, 5 out of 5. Alright, the results have once again been tabulated, and the final rankings for Season 2, from worst to best, are as follows. In last place is The Most Dangerous Match, with the irregular 15.5 out of 25. If these ranking videos continue, I'm not sure I'll continue the half-point scoring system. It's just not clean enough. But that's what Laurence Harvey and those sideburns drove me to. With 16 out of 25, we have The Greenhouse Jungle. I feel like I should explain in laborious detail how I added up this score as an homage to the overly explained kidnapping plot, but I won't put you or me through that. Requiem for a Falling Star is next, oddly enough, rising above the last two, with 17 out of 25. As we did last season, we have one tie, with The Most Crucial Game and Dagger of the Mind both earning 18 out of 25. There is a massive leap in quality as we jump up to 22 out of 25 for the season premiere, Etude in Black. Interestingly, there's an appearance by Peter Falk on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, where he's there in Columbo costume, of course, to promote this episode, and declares it to be the best episode they'd done up to that point. While I wouldn't personally agree, he would be the authority, and it is a very entertaining and well-made entry. The silver medal goes to A Stitch in Crime with 23 out of 25. And finally, the season's best is Double Shock, which earned my very first perfect score of 25 out of 25. Who knew how influential one cooking segment could be? Now, if you go back and compare it to my season 1 ranking, you will notice that first place went to Suitable for Framing, to which I gave 24 out of 25. Would I say Double Shock is better than Suitable for Framing? No. While I love them both, I think Suitable for Framing is superior, and my 1 point deduction based on a lack of Don Amici was very short-sighted of me. So, I will retroactively bump Suitable for Framing up to a matching 25 out of 25. Whew, that was a close one. Overall, while watching this season, I did get the feeling that it felt a little more middle of the road than the first one, with a few notable exceptions, and I think the scores reflect that. Other than ones like Double Shock or A Stitch in Crime, I'm not sure any others can rival something like Murder by the Book or Prescription Murder for being as memorable or as well written and tight as the best of season 1. I realize Prescription Murder was not in my first ranking, but I think it's still near the top of the list. But that's all I've got for today. The rest of the Columbo seasons are staring at me from their place on the shelf, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what the intrepid lieutenant has in store next. Adios for now.